Hey guys. So this is the first Holes video back from vacation. So we left off at the end of chapter 13 before vacation, and that was when Stanley had found that gold tube with the KB and a heart on the bottom of it, and then he was trying to decide whether he should keep it and show it to like Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendanski on his own, or if he should let X-Ray have it and X-Ray show so that X-Ray can get the day off. Um, and then you guys had to answer a journal prompt on what you would do if you were Stanley. He did gain some respect because he moved up in line in front of Zero. So that was kind of nice that he did gain that, but it doesn't seem like he's going to gain getting a day off because it seems like X-Ray is going to probably take that from him. So let's read and see what happens. This video, I'm going to be reading chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17 because the chapters are pretty short. Okay, so follow along in your copy and just sit back and enjoy listening. That night, as Stanley lay on his scratchy and smelly cot, he tried to figure out what he could have done differently, but there was nothing he could do. For once in his unlucky life, he was in the right place at the right time and still didn't help him. You got it? He asked X-Ray the next morning at breakfast. X-Ray looked at him with half-opened eyes behind his dirty glasses. I don't know what you're talking about, he grumbled. You know, Stanley said. No, I don't, X-Ray snapped, so just leave me alone, okay? I don't want to talk to you. Stanley didn't say another word. Mr. Sir marched the boys out to the lake, chewing sunflower seeds along the way and spitting out the shells. He scraped the ground with his boot heel to mark where each boy was supposed to dig. Stanley stamped down on the back of the blade of the shovel, piercing the hard, dry earth. He couldn't figure out why X-Ray snapped at him. If he wasn't going to produce the tube, why did he make Stanley give it to him? Was he just going to keep it? The tube was gold in color, but Stanley didn't think it was real gold. Also, make sure that you notice that Mr. Sir is showing them where they have to dig today, where normally they just go and dig in a random spot. The water truck came a little after sunrise. Stanley finished his last drop of water and stepped out of his hole. At this time of day, Stanley sometimes could see some distant hills or mountains on the other side of the lake. They were only visible for a short while and would soon disappear behind the haze of the heat and dirt. The truck stopped and the dust cloud drifted past it. X-Ray took his place at the front of the line. Mr. Pendanski filled his canteen. Thanks, Mom, X-Ray said. He didn't mention the tube. Mr. Pendanski filled all the canteens, then climbed back into the cab of the pickup. He still had to bring water to Group E. Stanley could see them digging about 200 yards away. Mr. Pendanski! X-Ray shouted from his hole. Wait! Mr. Pendanski! I think I might have found something. The boys all followed Mr. Pendanski as he walked over to X-Ray's hole. Stanley could see the gold tube sticking out of some dirt on the end of X-Ray's shovel. Mr. Pendanski examined it and took a long look at its flat bottom. I think the warden is going to like this. Does X-Ray get the day off? Asked Squid. Just keep digging until someone says otherwise, Mr. Pendanski said. Then he smiled. But if I were you, Rex, I wouldn't dig too hard. Stanley watched the cloud of dust move across the lake to the cabin beneath the trees. The boys in Group E were just going to have to wait. It didn't take long for the pickup to return. Mr. Pendanski stepped out of the cab. A tall woman with red hair stepped out of the passenger side. She looked even taller than she was since Stanley was down in his hole. She wore a black cowboy hat and black cowboy boots which were studded with turquoise stones. The sleeves on her shirt were rolled up and her arms were covered with freckles, as was her face. She walked right up to X-Ray. This is where you found it? Yes, ma'am. Your good work will be rewarded. She turned to Mr. Pendanski. Drive X-Ray back to camp. Let him take a double shower and give him some clean clothes. But first, I want you to fill everyone's canteen. I just filled them a little while ago, said Mr. Pendanski. The warden stared hard at him. Excuse me? She said. Her voice was soft. I had just filled them when Rex... Excuse me, the warden said again. Did I ask you when you last filled them? No, but it's just... Excuse me. Mr. Pendanski stopped talking. The warden wiggled her finger at him to come to her. It's hot and it's only going to get hotter, she said. Now these fine boys have been working hard. Don't you think it might be possible that they might have taken a drink since you last filled their canteens? Mr. Pendanski said nothing. The warden turned to Stanley. Caveman, will you come here, please? Stanley was surprised she knew his name. He had never seen her before until she stepped out of the truck, and he didn't even know the warden was a woman. He nervously went toward her. Mr. Pendanski and I have been having a discussion. Have you taken a drink since Mr. Pendanski last filled your canteen? Stanley didn't want to cause any trouble for Mr. Pendanski. I still got plenty left, he said. Excuse me? He stopped. Yeah, I drank some. Thank you. May I see your canteen, please? Stanley handed it to her. Her fingernails were painted dark red. She gently shook the canteen, letting the water swish inside the plastic container. Do you hear the empty spaces? She asked. Yes, said Mr. Pendanski. Then fill it, she said, and next time I tell you to do something, I expect you to do it without questioning my authority. If it's too much trouble for you to fill a canteen, I'll give you a shovel, and you can dig the hole, and Caveman can fill the canteen. She turned back to Stanley. I don't think that would be too much trouble for you, would it? No, said Stanley. So, what will it be? She asked Mr. Pendanski. Do you want to fill the canteens, or do you want to dig? I'll fill the canteens, said Mr. Pendanski. Thank you. Mr. Pendanski filled the canteens. The warden got a pitchfork out of the back of the pickup. She poked it through X-Ray's dirt pile to see if anything else might have been buried in there as well. After you drop off X-Ray, I want you to bring back 3 wheelbarrows, she said. X-Ray got in the pickup. As the truck pulled away, he leaned out the wide window and waved. 0, said the warden. I want you to take over X-Ray's hole. She seemed to know that 0 was the fastest digger. Armpit and Squid, you will keep digging where you have been, she said, but you're going to have a helper. Zigzag, you help Armpit. Magnet, you will help Squid. And Caveman, you will work with 0. We're going to dig the dirt twice. 0 will dig it out of the hole, and Caveman will carefully shovel it into a wheelbarrow. Zigzag will do the same for Armpit, and the same with Magnet and Squid. We don't want to miss anything. If either of you find something, you'll both get the rest of the day off, and a double shower. When the wheelbarrows are full, you are to dump them away from this area. We don't want any dirt piles to get in the way. The warden remained at the site for the remainder of the day, along with Mr. Pendanski and Mr. Sir, who showed up after a while. Occasionally, Mr. Sir would leave to take water to the other groups or campers, but otherwise, he and the water truck stayed parked there. The warden saw to it that nobody in Group D was ever thirsty. Stanley did as he was told. He carefully looked through all the dirt dug up by 0 as he shoveled it into a wheelbarrow, though he knew he wouldn't find anything. It was easier than digging his own hole. When the wheelbarrow was full, he took it a good distance away before dumping it. The warden couldn't keep still. She kept walking around, looking over the boys' shoulders, and sticking her pitchfork through the dirt piles. You're doing fine, just fine, she told Stanley. After a while, she took the boys to switch places so that Stanley, Zigzag, and Magnet dug in the holes, and 0, Armpit, and Squid shoveled the excavated dirt into the wheelbarrows. After lunch, 0 took over the digging again, and Stanley returned to the wheelbarrow. There's no hurry, the warden said several times. The main thing is to not miss anything. The boys dug until each hole was well over 6 feet deep and wide. Still, it was easier for 2 boys to dig a 6-foot hole than for 1 boy to dig a 5-foot hole. All right, that's enough for today, the warden said. I've waited this long, I can wait another day. Mr. Sir drove her back to her cabin. I wonder how she knew all of our names, Stanley said as he walked back to the compound. She watches us all the time, said Zigzag. She's got hidden microphones and cameras all over the place. In the tents, the rec room, the shower. The shower? Asked Stanley. He wondered if Zigzag was just being paranoid. The cameras are tiny, said Armpit. No bigger than a toenail on your little toe. Stanley had his doubts about that. He didn't think they could make cameras that small. Microphones, maybe. He realized that was why X-Ray didn't want to talk to him about the gold tube at breakfast. X-Ray was afraid the warden might have been listening. One thing was certain, they weren't just digging to build character. They were definitely looking for something, and whatever they were looking for, they were looking in the wrong place. Stanley gazed out across the lake toward the spot where he had been digging yesterday when he found the gold tube. He dug that hole into his memory. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. This is chapter 16. See what I'm saying? X-Ray said. Am I right or am I right? The other bodies in the room were little more than bags of flesh and bones dumped across broken chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. Yo, Caveman, my man, he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. Hey, slide on over, Squid, said X-Ray. Make room for the caveman. Stanley crashed on the couch. He had looked for a hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't seen anything. and he hoped the warden hadn't either. "What's the matter?" asked X-Ray. "You guys tired of or something?" He laughed. "Hey, keep it down, will you?" groaned Zigzag. "I'm trying to watch TV." Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was careful not to dump any of it in the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He thought that it might have been the lid to a fancy gold pen. KB could have been the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think of were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it didn't really look like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so they could get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them." After that, everyone worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran when he pushed his wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they weren't Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until after every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across an understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found, without getting himself or X-Ray into trouble. It didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging in that hole by himself, but the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig at night too. Besides, the shovels were locked up at night, presumably so they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Pendanski entered the rec room. "Stanley," he called as he made his way to him. "His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Pendanski. "My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter here for someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Pendanski. He turned over an envelope in his hands. "It doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. It was from his mother. "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in the big pocket of his pants. "Aren't you going to read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read it later after the boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of those other moms who can't afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I'm very proud of you for trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows? Maybe something good will come of this." This is foreshadowing. "Your father thinks he's real close to breaking to a breakthrough on his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord is threatening to evict us because of the odor. I feel sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe. It must have smelled awful. Love from both of us." "What's so funny?" Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. "Nothing, just something my mom wrote." "Nothing? Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Oh, what'd it say?" Zero asked. "Nothing." "Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Well, see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers, so the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking these old sneakers. So, anyway, in the letter my mom said she felt sorry for that little old lady who lived in the shoe, because it must have smelled bad in there." Zero stared blankly at him. The nursery rhyme?" Zero said nothing. "You've heard the nursery rhyme about the little old lady who lived in a shoe?" "No." Stanley was amazed. "How does it go?" asked Zero. "Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street?" Stanley asked. Zero stared blankly. Stanley headed on to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the 4th day when all 3 holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving late one morning, well after sunrise. "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing," said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. In just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. "How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" "I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backwards into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," the warden told Mr. Pendanski. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole, he scooped up some dirt, and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "It's your dirt." "Hey, Mom," Magnet called. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of his sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It isn't nap time. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up. Then Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been.